TownTalks is a project of the Westminster Town Hall Forum designed to engage the community in conversation and reflection on the key issues of our day from a just and equitable perspective.
Good evening, and welcome to TownTalks, a project of the Westminster Town Hall Forum. My name is Rubén Vázquez. I am both a member of the Forum's advisory board and your moderator for this evening. TownTalks' mission is to engage the community in conversation and reflection on key issues of our day-to-day lives from a just and equitable perspective. Tonight's topic, racial trauma and mental health. I'm joined tonight by two community mental health professionals to explore the reality of racial trauma and its effects on the body and the mind. We have with us tonight Brandon Jones, who is a psychotherapist, professor, and a consultant in the Twin Cities. He holds a BA in sociology from the University of Minnesota, a master's in community psychology from Metropolitan State University, and a master's in psychotherapy from Elder Graduate School. Brandon is also a 2013 Bush Fellowship Leadership Fellow. Terri Karis is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Stout. Her scholarly interests include embodied approaches to learning and to healing trauma. Licensed as a family therapist and a psychologist, Terri serves as the board of the Minnesota Trauma Recovery Institute and maintains a clinical practice in Minneapolis. Again, I am Rubén Vázquez. I am Vice President of Racial Justice and Public Policy at YWCA Minneapolis, where I am responsible for the overall leadership and strategy of YWCA's Race Equity and Public Policy program. To find out our TownTalks program informative and enriching, we request your financial support. Donations can be made at Town Hall Forum's website, westminsterforums.org. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And to ensure that we are all on the same page as far as common language, one of the first questions I would like us to start with is identifying, so when we talk about racial trauma or racialized trauma, what exactly does that mean? So, you want to start with?
Sure, I'll go ahead and put out some ideas.
We'll just kind of jump in.
Well, when we talk about living in a culture of white supremacy, which is how I think about the culture we live in, it's a culture of disconnection because there's a hierarchy, a ranking, and harm is done. So harm happens, and when people experience racism over and over again, there's trauma because when people are not treated as full human beings, it means they can't be safe in the world, they don't have value, fundamental value as a person. And sometimes people think about trauma as being like a big event. And it could be like an encounter with police. It's also important to recognize that the daily grind of living, being treated like you're not a full human being, takes a huge toll. And it's not a small thing, even though it happens in everyday ways every day. And so what we're talking about is the impact on people, their bodies, their hearts, their minds, when living in that kind of arrangement. So that's where what I'd offer as kind of a starting point, and Brandon, I'd be happy to have you add to it.
Yeah, I'll follow up with it. You know, the way that I define trauma in general is a deep emotional wound. You know, when I work with the community or I'm working with families or, you know, I'm doing programming, that's something that across the board people understand is a deep emotional wound that's taking place. So when we talk about racial trauma, it's a deep emotional wound that is due to being classified in a particular racial category or due to your ethnicity. So that's how I look at the definition of racial trauma.
You know, that's really interesting because as you're both sharing your definition of trauma, especially racial trauma, it triggered for me a personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So a few years back, heading to work, driving down the street, I got pulled over for speeding, and rightly so. I was speeding. You know, it's one of those like, okay, I got to get my stuff ready.
Mm-hmm.
When the police officer came up to me, it was a white police officer, and instead of asking me for my driver's license or insurance,
Mm-hmm.
he asked me for my green card,
Mm.
right? And when I said, well, I don't have a green card,
Yeah.
right? The next statement that came out of his mouth was, well, then does that mean that you're illegal, right?
Mm-hmm.
It never occurred to him that I would be a U.S. citizen, which
Right.
I am. So that experience has now shaped how I conduct myself, especially when I'm driving, right? So now, for example, when I leave my home, I have to make sure that, you know, like everybody else, you know, you have your wallet or your purse and your keys and, you know, your cell phone. But in addition to that, I also have to make sure that I have my passport, my U.S. passport with me, right? Because even though that happened to me a few years ago,
Right.
every single time I see a police officer either coming towards me or behind me, the first thing I think about is, you know, unlike the way, you know, we teach our black youth is when
Yeah.
they're driving is put your hands on the wheel, right? For me, I'm like, okay, where's my passport?
Right.
How accessible is my passport? Because I'm going to get pulled over and I'm going to be questioned on whether or not I belong here,
Right.
right? Just by that simple fact. So when you were talking about that trauma,
Yep.
I guess I knew what was happening for me, but it wasn't until I realized that it doesn't have to be a major impact
Right.
in my life. Something as, I don't know if I would call getting pulled over by a cop a simple incident, but it's something that happens a lot.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Right?
Mhm.
But for me, that has triggered something, and that has now reestablished for me in my head how I conduct myself when I get into my car.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, I'm not worried about whether or not I have my driver's license.
Yeah.
I'm worried about whether or not I have my U.S. passport.
Right.
You know, to prove.
Yeah. And you're just going to the grocery store.
And I'm just
You're
going to the
you're
grocery-
going to hang out with your friends, right? You're going to the movies, and you're traveling like you're going to another, country.
Right.
And think about how much stress that causes for just you or anyone else who's in that same kind of position and state where you have to make sure you have your papers on you. Like there's a historical lineage for that type of behavior. With the community I come from, African American folks, back in the 17, 18, and even sometimes in the 1900s, you need to have your papers on you because we need to know where you're going, where did you come from, and do you belong here? People still carry that mentality, those habits with them transgenerationally, and that causes a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And your cortisol levels are high, your anxiety is high, and that leads to an internalized oppression. We talk about microaggressions. That's something that happened, but then you start to internalize those microaggressions, and then you implement them on yourself. Like that puts a lot of damage on people.
So that's a great segue to another question that I had, is that microaggression.
Yep.
Right? We are hearing a lot of, microaggressions has become this buzzword,
Yep.
right?
Right.
Everything is about microaggressions. So with that, what is a microaggression? How do we define? How do we know that a microaggression is happening? How do we know that we are creating a microaggression or we're witnessing a microaggression?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, let me just say, I think often microaggression is used to mean something that might be called an everyday slight, meaning it happens regularly and it's considered to be a smaller kind of an incident than a big explicit incident
Right.
more often than not. So I think sometimes, maybe often, white people don't have a conscious awareness about what they're even doing. So if like one of the classic examples would be if I'm walking down the street and I have my purse over my shoulder and I see a man of color approaching and I, pull it close to me.
Yeah.
And I maybe am not even totally consciously aware of that. So, but I think for the person on the receiving end of that behavior, it's a complicated response because there's an awareness, and yet in encounters with other people, there can be ambiguity, and you think, maybe not so much with the purse example, but with other interpersonal interactions, like, did that just happen? Or like, what just happened?
Right.
Or am I making too big a deal of it? Like
Right.
going back to that sort of questioning oneself. But one of the things I read recently that actually I think this is a helpful perspective, and this came from Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Yeah.
Yep.
And he says, I no longer use that word microaggression, that he thinks the term abuse is more fitting, that this is abuse, and that this kind of persistent, continual abuse happening day after day has an extreme impact on people. And that totally makes sense to me, that this is not, micro makes it sound smaller, perhaps
Minimal.
insignificant. So even though it's not somebody beating you up, it's taking a toll.
Right.
Because it's happening over and over and over again. And where I would go, like with your example you used, Rubén, is when you have one of those experiences, then your body has learned, like there's a potential threat. Your body's on alert. Now you're living with that on alertness. And so, when you go to the grocery store, are you going to feel welcomed, or are you going to be targeted and viewed as suspicious? Right. Every time you go out to the grocery store, you may have that kind of activation happen in your body.
Absolutely.
Well, and even for me, right, one of the things I noticed to that point is, so as we went into lockdown because of the pandemic, right, one of the things I started doing is I started running just to kind of keep my body moving. But one of the things I also picked up not too long ago that I realized that I'm like, is when I go for a run in the morning, I, put on my earbuds, grab my phone to listen to music, but I'm also reaching and grabbing my ID and my passport. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm just going for a run.
Can't even work out.
I'm just going for a run. And that has become such a normal thing for me. And yet I'm like, that shouldn't be a normal thing for me.
Yeah, you shouldn't have to be.
Right. And it reminds me, that microaggression in my head, I kind of see it as you're talking about this. It's like, what is that saying? Death by a thousand cuts, right? Well, a little cut is not a big deal. Maybe 2 little cuts is, okay, it hurts a little bit.
Yeah. I have an example to connect both of your points. So for myself, I'm a black man. I'm a bigger black man, too. I have some size on me. And when COVID first started and we started to implement wearing masks, my wife said, I don't want you going to the grocery store. And she said, you're not going. She said, order those groceries. We'll have them delivered. We'll pay the extra $15. And I said, why? I'm just going to grab like 2 things. It's going to be fine. She said, no, because I'm scared that they're going to think you may be in there trying to steal and you may not come home. And that's a reality. And even since then, I've been in and out of, various different places. And I think about that. How am I going to look with this mask on, even coming in here today? What's going to be, the door was locked when I got here at first. I was like, let me go get back in my car. Let me wait a little bit because I don't want anybody to think that I'm trying to break in here. That's a reality that I face. And I've had people say, oh, that mask looks scary. So I had to buy different types of masks to figure out which one looked less intimidating for everyone. And no matter which one I had on, I still looked like a scary black man, which is kind of interesting. But these are the things that people have to think about. Even when we're trying to be safe and not pass, the coronavirus to each other, I still have to carry that racialized trauma with me. So.
Yeah, and, and that actually also leads me to another question, which I think we've kind of been touching already, is like, how has this racial trauma, have we, any of us experienced that personally, which I think, you share your experiences and I share my experiences, and how has that impacted our lives or family? A couple of years ago, my son came home from school and he said to me, biracial, my wife is white, I'm Mexican, so our kids are biracial. And, we've been working really hard to ensure that our kids understand both cultures and both languages and everything, right? But a couple of years ago, my son came to me and said, so in the playground today, 2 kids came up to me and said, you know what, you need to go to a different school because you are not white enough. And this school is for white people. So, of course, my initial reaction was, as a father, right, I was just furious. I was fuming. So anyway, we had a conversation with the school. We dealt with that at that point. But again, I felt we had dealt with it. We could move on. But then a couple of years later, like literally 2 years later, my son came up to me. He said, okay, I think I'm ready now. And I was like, ready for what?
Yeah.
He's like, I think I'm ready to start speaking Spanish again.
Wow.
And I was like, wait, what do you mean? He's like, well, after what happened, I decided that I did not want to speak Spanish. I didn't want to be Mexican.
Right.
Right? Because I didn't want to be that outsider.
Right.
I mean, first of all, as a father, that hurt.
Yeah.
Second of all, as somebody who's Mexican, that hurt.
Yep.
Right? But again, it's that trauma that stays with you, which, again, I felt bad because for 2 years he was carrying this around with him. I did not even think about checking in with him and saying, hey, how are you doing because of that experience? We assumed we had fixed it.
Right.
Because we talked to the school, right? So with that said, I would like to kind of get your take on, because of that racial trauma that we experience, either we experience it or we have seen it in other people, what impacts do you see that having in family, in society, in culture?
Yeah.
Well, I think, like, when I think about the story you've just told about your son, part of what I think about with trauma is that it's about disconnection. So he felt he had to disconnect from parts of himself in order to belong, because he was in a setting that said being white is the right way to be. And so he couldn't just relax and be himself. He had to keep some of himself out of connection. And then, you find out a couple years later, but still, for a while, you didn't know that. Your son, for whatever reason, didn't feel like he could bring that home. So that then makes him more isolated when he's trying to fit in one place, but has to, shape himself in order to be acceptable. So that's one of the things that comes to my mind immediately, is just that sense of the price he pays in order to try and have connection at school.
Yeah. And he's young, and he already has learned that he has to adjust and adapt. And disclose a piece of himself to quote unquote fit in. We open by saying we live in a system of white supremacy and racism. And one of the key things to understand is white has become the standard. And you have to meet that standard. And, I talk to a lot of white folks. It's Minnesota. And one of the things that white folks always say that I find funny is, I don't really have a culture. And I'm like, well, where's your heritage from? And like, I don't know, I'm a mutt. My dad's from Poland. My mom got Italian. And it's like, but you have a culture still. And whiteness has become the culture. We call it white privilege. I use the term white advantage because that has been what has been set as a precedence. And we have to all, us as non-white people, we have to meet that standard and meet that goal. And we do things like change our names. Stop speaking our native languages, changing our haircuts, being mindful of the clothes that we wear. Again, we talk about microaggressions that happen upon ourselves, but we internalize those things and those daily slights to fit in all the time. That becomes extremely stressful, and that's why we see things where you have people of color who have hypertension issues, have issues with stress, have undiagnosed mental health issues. These things go on, and we're talking about this is a young guy, right? This is a little one who's developing. He's saying, I'm gonna take 2 years off of Spanish to see if people might treat me different because I want to fit in. I don't want to be treated as an outsider. That is very difficult, but unfortunately, kids of color of all different nationalities have to do that. They have to, take a piece of themselves away just to fit in and be comfortable so their white friends can accept them, and I think that that's unfortunate.
It is totally unfortunate, and like I said, once we had that conversation a couple of years later, I felt bad because I'm like, what could I have done different?
Yeah.
Right? I should have checked in with him, but, and then the fact that he carried that with him for a couple of years, right? Thankfully, he got to a point where he's like, okay, I can move past that, and he was able to share, and we were able to work through that, right? But, and that brings me to another question that I wanted to ask and have a conversation of the difference between trauma, right? And we talked a little bit about trauma as a whole, but also that versus racial trauma.
Yeah.
Right? And what is the difference between them? Because some people will say, either some people watching tonight, or I've heard people say, well, trauma is trauma, period. Right? Same idea where people will say, all lives matter.
Yep.
Right? What's the big deal? Why are we continuing to separate?
Right.
Right? So I want to talk a little bit about that, about the difference between trauma versus racial trauma, and so the difference between it, and why is it important that we name it racial trauma versus just trauma?
Yep.
So,
Let me go first. So for me, the reason why there's a stark difference between trauma and racial trauma is because people who endure racial trauma have learned how to cope and exist with it. They've developed culture. We have developed culture around it just to exist. In the black community, we used to call black culture the struggle. We called it the struggle because many of us were struggling just to live and to survive. And it's almost like an inside joke at this point, cultural joke at this point, that we called our cultural struggle, but the reality is we continue to struggle. We continue to have these, incidents that take place in these struggles in our communities and these inequalities that end up happening to us that causes a lot of stress, and it gets passed from one generation to the next. Yes, everybody does experience some level of trauma. Sure, you get into a bad car accident on 94, that's traumatic, right? But do you build a culture around car accidents? But if my child chooses not to speak Spanish for 2 years of his life, he has developed a cultural habit to take a piece of himself away. That is the difference.
Terri?
Yeah, I guess I'll come at it from a little bit different angle.
Sure.
I've been really influenced by the work of Resmaa Menakem and his book, My Grandmother's Hands. And Resmaa is writing about a body-based approach to thinking about racialized trauma. And so, I'm not sure if I'm going to quite get right the way he puts it all, but drawing on that, I would say trauma is trauma in the body. So whether it's from a car accident or whether it's from developmental childhood trauma or racial trauma, what happens in the nervous system when something is too much, too fast, too soon, and it overwhelms a person's capacity in their body, is that we have trauma responses built in that help us survive. Fight, flight, freeze, dissociate. And sometimes people add in some others, but those are kind of the basics. And so if it's too much, according to our body, our body's designed to keep us alive, we're going to go into one of those kind of reactions. So there is a way that I think trauma is trauma in the body. And yet, I think part of the reason to pull out racialized trauma is because we need to be able to hold complexity and have a nuanced conversation, because there are some particularities about racialized trauma, and I think it goes back to what you were saying, Brandon, about a group identity.
Right.
So, you know, when an African American person sees or hears about a police shooting of an African American, whether they saw it or not, like there's an impact because there's an identification with community, and also because certain traumas like slavery, internment, genocide, impacted entire groups.
Right.
And so when you're in community with other people whose nervous systems are dysregulated, that's going to shape how parenting is done. That's going to shape how and when conflicts happen.
Right.
It's going to have a lot of impact on interpersonal relationships, and those relationships are shaping the children.
Exactly.
You know, it's so interesting that you're talking about that, because as you're talking about this, it's triggering conversations that I have had with my kids, right? And I didn't even think about the conversation I was having with my kids until you're speaking right now, that I'm like, oh my God, because this was a little while ago. My wife came home. She and the kids had gone to Target, came home, and she's like, did you talk to the kids about when they walk into Target, how they should act? And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, well, we're at Target, the kids grab something from the shelf, and they're walking around with their hands up. And I was like, why are you walking with that like that? And their response was like, oh, well, that's what Papa taught us to do. Because that's my reality, right? When I walk into a Target or Home Depot or whatever, right? If I grab something from the shelf, I either immediately put it in the cart, or I hold it away from my body. Because if I hold it close to me,
you might be viewed with suspicion.
Right? Because of the color of my skin.
Right.
Because of that perception, right? So it's that, I mean, as you're talking about it here, I'm like, oh my goodness, I am just as, I don't want to say as guilty, because guilty makes it sound like it's my fault, right? But I am, I'm part of that, right? That racial.
Yeah, well, that's, to me, is a protective response.
Right.
And, when you're a parent, of course you want to protect your children and prepare them for what you're anticipating is going to be their reality. And I also think it's a really hard thing as a parent to, you don't want your children to anticipate danger in the world, and yet we have to prepare them. So it's understandable to me you would be protective in that way.
So from that perspective, as a parent of biracial children, as we're talking, and I'm sure parents of color are listening to us tonight, how do we talk to our children, right, from that, to protect them? And yet not make them freak out.
Right.
Right? I mean, I'm assuming there's like a fine line in there somewhere where it's like, I want to talk to my kids about this is how you act, but at the same time, I don't want you to overreact either, because you still have to move through the world and do things, right? So what do we do?
Yeah. I have a little alternative view on what we do as parents. So I get a lot of parents that ask me that question. Parents that have biracial children, parents that have children of color, parents that have white parents. Like, what do I tell my white son? He's 17. Well, how do I help him? And I say, one of the biggest things that I've learned about parenting, whether this is in textbooks, helping parents, or my own experiences, is children watch what you do more than what you say. And when you're, just like your children, they've seen you hold those items out. You might not have said, hold the items out when you're in here. They might have just watched daddy do it. They're like, well, maybe this is the reason why daddy does it, right? Children will watch what you do. So just as important as telling your children things is actually, you know, being about what you say. I think one of the most important things we can do for all children is be honest with them about what's going on in the world, and be honest at their level, though, right? I don't think it's responsible to tell your 4 or 5-year-old all the graphic details of George Floyd, right? But they need to understand that something happened, and this is what's going on in the cities, and this is what's happening in their world. So being honest, giving them information at their level, but at the same time, being able to model what you're saying to them. Because if you tell your children, you know, look, you need to treat everybody with respect, no matter what they look like or, you know, what language they speak, that's important. But if you don't do it, then it starts to create a divide. And your children don't believe you, and your children start to question, you know, how should I actually act, right? You know, you're one of the main influencers on your children. I also think that it's important to have conversations with your children, because if you don't, they can just ask Siri and Alexa questions, and they can find their own information anyway. So it's better for you to ask them, and then for them to go figure it out on their own, because they may stumble upon information that isn't the most healthy for them to have. So.
Well, I'm going to go back in the body direction, and it's sort of a variation on what Brandon said, but I think, you know, helping kids stay connected in their bodies so that they get cues about, am I safe or not?
Yep.
And they also have the capacity to take action and mobilize if they need to get out of there, or if they, you know, they need to do something in order to become more safe. So
when you say connected to their bodies,
yeah.
say more about that.
Well,
What does that mean?
I just think there's so much disconnection from our bodies that, you know, I would say this is part of whiteness, to have the mind-body split,
Right.
and to see mind and body as separate. But I think a lot of things in our culture take us away from our actual embodied experience. And so going back to the book I mentioned earlier by Resmaa Menakem, he would say, in order to heal from racial trauma, and this, I'm partly trying to be preventive, one of the key skills would be, do you know how to calm and soothe your body? So can you settle down? And this is, you know, this gets talked about as regulation.
Right.
Regulation is kind of a big word these days, and talking about what do you want to help kids do? You know, it means, can they settle their energy when they need to settle, and can they mobilize when they need to do something? And this gets out of whack when we have traumatic experiences. So kids who learn to stay attuned to what's happening in their bodies, so to notice and not override.
Yep.
You know, how much energy do I have? Or, oh, you know, I'm getting exhausted and I need to, like, just sit for a little bit. Kids need, I think, support to tune into their own rhythms. And if they're in their body, it's gonna help them be safer in the world.
So then that kind of leads to another question that I had regarding stressors,
Yep.
right? So in your experience and in the work that you do, are there different racialized stressors that happen between white bodies and BIPOC, or, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color bodies? And if so, what are they? And I mean, I would be curious to find out, like, what's the difference? Like, why is there a difference? So,
I don't know if the stressors, I don't know if the stress that we take in is different, but I think the things that cause the stress can be. So for, again, my own personal experience, I have to be very cognizant of what I say, how loud I say it, how I appear in rooms, where do I sit, what do I wear? Like, these are all the masks that I wear now, you know. It's not even an accessory anymore, it's a guarantee. But these are things that go through my mind. Where to wear the mask, what store to go to and not to go to. I think that these are experiences that many white folks don't have to have. They don't have to question how to move and operate in a society, because white folks can go and do almost whatever they want. It's kind of like the concept that we have right now of Karenism or Karens, right? Where we have all these videos of white women who are telling people of color, not just black folks, but all different types of people of color, you can't be in this park, or what are you doing here? And it's like, that's a stressor that I have to deal with, that if I encounter a white woman, is she going to say something about what I'm doing? Should I not be here? Is she going to say that I tried to touch her or rape her? Like, those are things that I have to seriously think about. In professional settings, in my personal life, online, these are things that, as a black person, I always have to be cautious of. And I think that that's a stressor that many white people don't have to actually consider often. So,
Yeah. Well, what I would add to that is kind of circling back to making a distinction between trauma and racial trauma.
Okay.
And so, white people have experienced lots of different kinds of traumas. And Resmaa Menakem writes about, the traumas that are in white bodies from generations ago. Right. Because, many of the white people who came here to this continent actually were fleeing something. They were getting away from oppression or some kind of circumstances that were not favorable. And so that trauma has been passed down and is in white bodies now. Even separate from that, white people have experienced all kinds of traumas.
Right.
But we aren't positioned the same as people of color. This culture is organized for our racial comfort. Right. And so I think what can happen, though, is in the body, if a person's experienced trauma, they can easily get activated into fight, flight, or freeze if there's a threat. So, for example, I want to be, a conscious, good white person. I don't want to say something offensive. I want to say and do the right thing. I've got maybe my perfectionistic standards coming out of my own trauma history. And so now when I have an encounter with a person of color, I've got this extra pressure inside me to do it right. And that can lead to different things, right. Maybe I get defensive right away. There's a fight response when someone calls me out on something. Or maybe I just shut down and I feel a lot of shame and I can't find my voice, so I don't stand up for something that is against my values. Right. And so I would call those racialized stress responses in the body. They aren't equivalent to the racial trauma that Brandon's talking about, but it's trauma that it's in response to a racialized encounter. So that's how I think about, and there's, lots of variations about how that can play out for white people, but I think it's a huge thing if we're going to make a difference with racism. I really think it's important for white people to build more capacity in our bodies so we can handle the intensity, move away from the comfort, and be able to do less harm and help hold each other accountable.
So how do white people build more capacity in their bodies, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things in the work that I do, one of the things that I always have conversations with people is like, I'm an immigrant, my family and I immigrated to the Twin Cities from Mexico City 40 years ago. And when I first arrived here, and for many years, I kept on hearing this term, Minnesota nice. Yep. Minnesota nice, right? And for a long time, I interpreted that to mean like, oh, Minnesota is just full of a lot of nice people, right? Which there are a lot of nice people, don't get me wrong. But as I started digging into this work and realizing, and really kind of being a part of this space, I started realizing Minnesota nice is not about that you're being nice. Minnesota nice is that you don't want to have those difficult conversations, right? You don't want to offend somebody, right? You don't want to talk about race, right? What are the things that all of us grew up with, right? It's like you don't talk about race, you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about sex. And yet all of those things are part of who we are.
Right.
They're part of our society. And yet we have been taught not to talk about them. So as members of the white community, when you're talking about they need to build space, right, to be able to have these conversations, what does that look like? Or
Yeah. Well, I'm going to borrow again from Resmaa. I think white people need to help each other out. So to have white community that's explicitly anti-racist in its intentions, which means to work with each other in support of a larger vision, to help each other be able to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so that, as you do it, you practice, you expand your capacity to go there, to those difficult places. And you also get support from other white people saying, no, you aren't a bad, awful person just because you blew it in that interaction. Here, let's talk about how to help you do it differently next time. Because there's so much isolation because we're in this culture of individualism, and everybody is so separate and autonomous in their sense of self. I think it's really challenging whiteness to build community, supportive community with other white people, to build capacity to challenge racism, rather than thinking, oh, I'm the good white person who's got it together, and look at what that person did. I can't believe they did that. That isn't going to be helpful to us. So to build white culture that's something other than white supremacists, to interrupt that. But I think we need to do it collectively, partly because our nervous systems, we feel each other. So if I'm shaky and I'm having trouble finding my voice and standing up for my values, I really need to feel people, white people at my back supporting me, not putting this burden on people of color, which I think happens pretty often, that white people, who venture into expressing themselves around race, then seek some reassurance from people of color. Let me know that I'm a good person, and that you see what a good person I am. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about white people in that role, so that we don't put that burden on people of color.
Brandon, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, if we're going to look at it historically, like Resmaa did, white people aren't nice to white people. I mean, historically, they haven't been. And I think Minnesota Nice has another level to it of passive aggressiveness. It makes it easy to have a enemy or a target that's not white. But when white folks are in space with white folks, I think this is one of the reasons why it's hard for them to talk about racism amongst themselves, because internally they end up battling a lot about things. There's a lot of divisiveness, very objective culture. White folks love a versus, right? You have Democrat or Republican or liberal versus conservative. Like, that's a very white concept on things, is to have like these categories of things, and it makes it very, very easy to come together around whiteness when you have a collective identity. And I think that's one of the secret sauces of this this white culture, is this autonomy of being individualized, because we could say, well, I had all this on my own merit. I did this myself. But you don't understand that white culture allows that to actually happen. And I think that allows for that Minnesota niceness to kind of fester and to be. And folks who are from Minnesota, who are people of color, like myself, we have a version of Minnesota nice as well. And because we pick up on the same culture, which is the dominant culture, but we still can't achieve that level of being white because we're just not. So that's something that also needs to happen with this conversation when we talk about what can white people do to build capacity. I think they do need to have conversations with themselves, but they also need to have compassion for each other as well, because white folks are not nice to white folks.
And that's one of the things again, back into the work that I do, I've always, tell people it's okay, especially white people, right? Yep. It's okay as you're moving into this space. You're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. You're going to say some things that you're going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that, right? I mean, I've been doing this work for a very, very long time, and I still do that, right? So it's okay. I think it's to give people that permission, I guess, to go through these conversations, right? Because when we're talking about racial justice, again, that's a journey,
Yep.
right? And you're going to go through that journey at different phases, right? Even the three of us sitting here,
Yep.
right? We are in different spots within that journey,
Right.
right? And giving, especially white people, that space to make mistakes or to ask questions, right? In 2016, I was running for office, for state office, and part of that requires, to go door knocking and to get on the phones and to talk to people. And I remember having a conversation with this woman on the phone one night, and we were talking, and I was telling her about my platform and what I believe and what I stand. Great conversation. But then at the end, she said, Rubén, I want to ask you a question, but I also want to be careful because I don't want to offend you. I said, okay, ask. She said, do you prefer to be called Latino or Hispanic? Right? So we had that conversation, right? But then after we had that conversation, I went back and I asked her, I said, what made you get to the point to feel comfortable enough to ask me that question, even though you started with, I don't want to offend you, like you knew that there was a possibility that you might offend me, and she said, because through this conversation, you gave me the space to be comfortable making a mistake if I was about to make the mistake, right? So I get it that was being put on me as a person of color, right? So I acknowledge that. But to your point is, pushing white people to have these conversations with other white people and being and having their backs, right? Like you said, right? Supporting each other, because otherwise we're going to continue to deal with this whole Minnesota Nice thing, which personally, that's one of the things that's getting in our way, right? This whole Minnesota Nice. So with that, I was just looking at the time, and surprisingly enough, we're almost at an hour, which, wow. There's just so much else to talk about and to unpack, but what would be, and we've kind of touched a little bit on this already, but what would be some of your suggestions or ideas or recommendations for people to continue to move through this space, right? You've mentioned RESMA several times, so that's a reference, right, that we can talk about. I personally would encourage, especially white people, to listen to or read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, right? It's a phenomenal book from, what does that mean from that perspective, right? But what are other things that people can do, whether they're white people or people of color? What are some of the things that we can continue to do to move through this journey of, racial justice and realizing that we have this racial trauma thing that we have to deal with? So,
yeah. So, my suggestions for white folks would be to be authentic with yourself. Like, keep it real with yourself as best as possible. If you don't know something, that's okay. If you do, that's great too. But be willing to seek information from outside sources, and don't put all the pressure on your friends or your family members or your colleagues of color to educate you on certain things. There is tons of information out there. Netflix has great documentaries. YouTube has all different types of videos. It's okay for you to go out there and just seek out whatever information is necessary for you and what you're trying to learn. The other thing that I would say is know what your values are and why are those your values. So kind of doing some self-reflection. We come into this world without a worldview, but as we go through our life, we start to develop that. And our worldview is influenced by the people we're around, by the settings that we're in, and sometimes those values that we've learned might not be the most appropriate values for where we are today. So just questioning what those values are, I think, is always important. My suggestions for non-white people, for people of color, would be similar to that. Be who you are, but don't be afraid to, have new experiences. Don't be afraid to have these dialogues, and don't be afraid to let someone know that you have been offended. And I think a lot of times, people of color, we keep things in too long, and they do become stressors, and they do manifest into mental health or emotional health problems because we're always dealing with the pressure and the stress. Seek out help. Doesn't always have to be professional help. Sometimes it could just be a good friend or somebody who's willing to listen but take the best care of yourself if you can.
So with that, and I do want to get your recommendations, but that another question that kind of triggered for me is, especially for communities of color,
Yep.
right? Mm-hmm. How can communities of color seek that help, especially if they need that professional help, when, I can tell you I have been to therapy myself, and I can
Yep.
tell you the expense of that.
Yep, very expensive.
Right? It's an expensive thing to do. So if that is a barrier for communities of color, but yet they need that help, right? Because there will be times when I'm assuming that people just need that professional help.
Right.
What do we do? How do we, what are some of the resources that are out there that can help these individuals get that help that they need?
Mm-hmm. There are many clinics throughout the Twin Cities that offer sliding fee scale or free services, but they're not always the most accessible. So one thing that I often suggest community of colors to do is to do what we've been doing for a long time, because this is not new stressors for us. Start developing your own healing practices amongst yourselves, whether that's just 4 friends getting together, whatever activities you're doing, just make sure that they're healthy activities. We used to have churches that were very instrumental in many different communities. We used to have places to go to get that healing. Sometimes it was just grandma's house where, the family gets together and they're just talking about what's going on at work, what's going on in the family, and then there's solutions thrown out and people get help. We need to have that back, because we've always had our own healing kind of practices. It doesn't have to be in the European mental health model. It doesn't work for everybody, to be honest with you. As a mental health professional, and that's one of the reasons why I've kind of taken a step back from doing therapy day to day. Me giving you a clinical diagnosis does not guarantee that I'm going to help you with your racial healing. That's just the reality. But we live in a society that looks at it as, you go to this licensed mental health professional, they may give you a prescription, right? Because you need some medication, and they're going to tell you exactly what's wrong with you and exactly how to fix it. That doesn't work for everybody. Healing looks different for different people, and a lot of times it's about taking care of your physical body, taking care of your spiritual self, and taking care of your mental self. And you can do that. You don't always need a professional to help you, but if you feel like you do need a professional, there are resources out there, great places. North Point Health and Wellness Center, Kente Circle, Wilder Foundation. There's a lot of people out there that are doing this good work.
Terri, any recommendations?
Well, I just think Brandon said a lot there in terms of healing practices that communities already have and know about. So I think that's really important to find what gives you pleasure in healthy ways, whatever you consider healthy ways. But I think communally, because then we help balance each other's nervous systems. So to sing together, to dance together, to cook together, these kinds of activities can be really healing. And I think this is true for everybody.
Yeah.
But some communities really have those practices, that they've drawn on a lot. And the other thing I would add in the body-based direction is when we get into a trauma response, it's usually stuck in on, or sometimes stuck in off. But if you're stuck in on, you need to pause. And I'm not talking about, going and taking a soak in the hot tub or something. I'm talking about, can you just take a conscious breath right now? Can you take two breaths? Just to pause, because that helps your nervous system move in the direction of more balance. You can do that anywhere, anytime. And so I think putting more pauses in your day is a way that we can help ourselves with racial trauma and with stress in general.
So with that, I think just taking that breath, I personally have caught myself a couple of times just kind of stopping and just taking that deep breath, right? Because it helps. From a physical perspective, like I said, right, I've taken up running, which, to be perfectly honest with both of you, I hate running. But it has helped me so much.
Yeah.
In a really weird way. Like when I feel that I'm getting stressed, even my wife or even my kids will be like, do you need to go for a run? Right? Because they know that that's what helps me, right? a side note on that, which, it's a good benefit, is like, I've lost weight because of it, right? That was not my intent, but
Right.
it's a positive. So thank you both for a great conversation tonight. It's an awesome topic, an important topic to continue to have. I know that we cannot get to everything in 1 hour, but with that, I want to thank everybody out there for joining us tonight. I want to remind all of you again that if you enjoyed tonight's program, we do want to continue to offer these services, these programs. So please make a donation again at westminsterforums.org to continue to be able to offer these. With that, I just want to end by saying, please mark your calendars for Thursday, September 17th at 7 p.m. again for another panel discussion where we're going to be talking about geography of racism in the Twin Cities. With that, thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.
Stay safe and be well.
Absolutely.
Have a good night.